all of us as reporters know what we're good at, right? We're good at telling stories of people. We're, as investigative reporters, often very good at telling people what's wrong and what's broken and laying out lines of accountability. We're even pretty good at explainers, at explaining stuff. But one of the big sources of frustration for so many of us, and a big source of frustration too for the news-consuming public, often is that we may define the problem or define the crisis, and yet don't always point the way forward. One of the most simple and brilliant innovations to come out of the world of journalism in the last few years is to take that as a challenge and to create an approach, a radical and yet simple approach called solutions journalism. And I can't think of a field to which it's better applied than reporting on children, in which children are about the future. Our reporting is pitched toward the future, and we need to come up with some strategies and tactics for incorporating possibility and incorporating attainable victories and incorporating things that people can do, the communities can do, the governments can do, into our work, so that we're writing for the future as much as we're writing for the moment. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mikhael Simmonds from the Solutions Journalism Network. He'll talk more about what that is, but it's a movement within journalism to take stuff that we already do and add a few new things to it and come up with a philosophy of positive and forward-looking journalism that is tough, that is thorough, that is committed and hard-hitting, but is forward-looking as well as critical. I think I will just hand it to you from there.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Oh, I know it's early morning, but let's get some energy in here. Good morning, everyone. All right, that's more like it. So as Bruce said, my name is Mikhael Simmonds. I am with the Solutions Journalism Network. Before I begin, who here has heard about solutions journalism, besides when Bruce mentioned it? All right, who here had a training in solutions journalism? Okay, so just to get a feel of the room, what do you think solutions journalism is? Just shout it out from wherever you are. I was a professor, so I have no problem pointing out people. What, anyone else? Same thing, copy and paste. All right, one more person. Yes. Yeah, you are all correct. We see what we do as much more of being a toolkit than a philosophy. Many times we discuss about how we could do journalism better, and it stays in a philosophical or academic realm. We really much care about doing it on the ground as a journalist. What questions do we ask? Who do we speak to? How do we frame this story? So the workshop today will be around that. But a little bit more about Solutions Journalism Network. Solutions Journalism Network was founded in 2013 with one goal: to legitimize the spread and practice of solutions journalism, rigorous reporting about responses to social problems and the associated results. That is simply it. Everything else is icing on the cake. We work with newsrooms, news partnerships. We have online learning platforms, a basic toolkit which goes deeper into what I'll be presenting today. We have toolkits for education. We have toolkits For investigative journalists, we have toolkit, and the toolkits are translated in about 5 or 6 languages. We are building communities. So freelancers and journalists could come together to discuss and brainstorm stories and share resources and learn from each other. And we also have the university outreach, which really doesn't just reach out to university students and professors, but also policymakers and movers and shakers in these different platforms. My job specifically is to work with newsrooms, newsroom partnerships. We have worked with over 140 newsrooms to date. By the end of the year, we should probably be to 160. Most of them are in the United States, but we've also worked in Kenya and worked with journalists from Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Tanzania, other places in Latin America, other places in South Asia, places in Europe as well. And my job is to train newsrooms, the entire team, how to integrate solutions journalism into your reporting, into your beat. So the objectives today are simple. What is solutions journalism, what it isn't, why it's important, and how to incorporate this approach to your journalism. 2 things I ask of you. 1, we're all journalists here, so feel free to ask questions, feel free to push back, feel free to go a little deeper. We care about learning, we at Solutions Journalism care about learning and honing the technique a lot more. We are not the arbiter of all knowledge. You are out in the field as well. And secondly, before we move forward, I'd like you all to think about story ideas or even write it down, whether it's on your phone or in a notebook, just for 1 minute, a story idea that you think you could have done with a solutions lens or that you can do with a solutions lens moving forward. As we go through this presentation, I want you to tweak that idea, make notes around it, change it a little bit, add some more to it. Think of this as a workshop for that story idea through the solutions lens. So we're just going to take 1 minute to write down that idea or to just think about that idea through a solutions lens as you think about what it is right now. All right. Everyone ready? Let's try this again. Is everyone ready? I love your enthusiasm. All right, so what is solutions journalism? As defined, it is simply rigorous evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems, as I mentioned before. That is how we define it internally. I'm going to go through why it's important and break down what it is and what it isn't. So in 2014, this was the cover of Bloomberg Business Week. When you see this, what comes to your mind? 2014, by the way, this is when the Ebola crisis was on the front of every newspaper in the United States, the headline of every piece of journalism. What comes to your mind? Scary? Panic? Alarmist? Anyone else? Sorry? Yes. I know. And you would think, right? You know, Ebola is coming. The US had a chance to stop the virus in its tracks, but it missed. We're still here. It's in red as if it was blood marked on a wall. This is the type of fear that was being spread. And not to say it wasn't important, but this is not the whole story. Ebola is coming. This is the inside. The Ebola epidemic in West Africa poses a catastrophic threat to the region and could yet spread further. October 18th, 2014. People in suits carrying out the dead body. That's the first image you see. If anyone has reported in zones like this is something you may see often. But though this is important to tell, this is an important story to highlight, this is not the whole story. How Nigeria stopped Ebola. Check the date. 2 days later. Ebola wasn't stopped in 2 days. Just let that sink in for a second. Now, what is the difference here? This is what happens when you don't just report about what the problem is, but you report about responses to said problem. in any area of coverage, any type of journalism you do, especially in a crisis, there are people responding to the issue, responding to a problem. Your subjects are not victims, just laying on the ground waiting for someone to come and save them. They have agency. We need to report on that as well. It's interesting because in 2014, I was actually in New York, and the height of the Ebola crisis was happening. And on 145th, just about 2 miles from here, one of the doctors who was in Liberia actually came to the US, and she had Ebola, and they locked down like 2-block radius so no one could pass by. And that was just one person. So it's funny how when we tell a story from one part, we only get fear. But when we tell a whole story, you really get the holistic version of what's going on. Our co-founder, David Bornstein, usually says, problems scream, but solutions whisper. And we ask journalists to listen to those whispers, figure out what's going on, and tell those stories as well. Solution Journalism Network was started by 3 journalists, and they have reported around the world on a number of crises. And they thought and they saw that this story was being missed, that whisper was being missed. And they wanted to have that whisper become a shout. They decided to put their journalistic skills and apply it. The idea is not to have fluff. It's not about a feel-good story, but it's about rigorous reporting about that response. So I'm going to go through some imposters of solutions journalism before we get into real examples of it. And again, feel free to ask questions throughout this entire thing. Solutions journalism is not hero worship. Yes, it's good to tell these stories about these amazing people we have in our community or communities. Nothing's wrong with that. This is not bad journalism. This is good journalism. But this is not what solutions journalism is. Solution journalism cares about the systemic change. What has changed in this community? What can others learn about this change? What can be applied across borders or communities or ethnic lines or agencies? You know, you can't just take one amazing person from this country and drop them into another place and recreate them. That's not helpful for someone who's dealing with malaria. The systemic change is what's important. And this is where the rigorous reporting comes into play. Understanding what has changed, what is working, what is the response. Solution journalism is not a silver bullet. There are very few problems in the world where one solution solves everything, especially when you're dealing with complex problems that intertwine race, economics, geography, history, health. What you can do is tone down the rhetoric, talk about the limitations, take a slice of that large problem and figure out how people are responding to it. If you're dealing with early childhood education, you can't solve all of it, but you could think about how people are responding to transporting kids from point A to point B, getting them through school, thinking about resources. Those are all slices of the issue that are important to talk about. There are really ever one solution, one silver bullet. This story, for example, the first one talks about how this ball would revolutionize the poorest of playgrounds, as it says. It reads as if it were, this ball could literally save a life. Like this ball is just going to stop everything bad happening in your world. The second story talks about the nuance, what it does, what happens when this is in place. It also talks about the fact that when you create an indestructible ball, it's expensive to transport. You have to talk about the limitations and the caveats as well. It is not a think tank piece. Instead, show what's working now. Again, think tanks are important to understand the world around you and what people are thinking about, analyzing the past, looking at the present, and looking forward to the future. But we as journalists, we believe, in solution journalism, believe that we have to look at what's happening now. What are the results now? What are the limitations now? What are the caveats now? How it's being applied as opposed to a theory that's not being applied anywhere. A think tank is a good place to start looking for your story. But ask yourself, is this theory being applied in a community somewhere, in a country somewhere, in a region somewhere? And then go to that place or ask people from that place in your neighborhood, how is this working? Is this working well? Is this not working well? What are the limitations? It is not an afterthought. Many times news organizations say, we do solutions journalism, and they have a 10-part series about the problem and then 1 part about the solution. We ask you to change that dynamic, especially if everyone already knows what the problem is. If everyone knows the problem in your city is traffic, you don't need 10-part series talking about the problem being traffic. Talk about how people are responding to it, how other places have responded to this. What are the benefits? It is not just vox pop. This is not going around asking people, hey, what do you think should be done? What do you think should be done? What do you think should be done? This is about rigorous reporting. You can ask people questions about that rigorous reporting, really build a level of engagement, audience engagement. But this is about the reporting and the evidence, the anecdotes and the data. And lastly, it's not fluff. Look at substance. What does this mean for the agriculture? What does it mean for trade? What does it mean for economics in this case? My boss always says, solutions journalism isn't always good, isn't always positive, but it's always useful. And that's what you should keep in mind while doing this. So what is solutions journalism? It is solutions journalism if it features not just a person, but the response to a problem and how it happened. Provides available evidence of results. Seeks to provide insights that can help others to respond to the problem. Discuss the limitations and avoids reading like a puff piece. Talk about the caveats. Dives into the how-to implementation of the response. This is not just saying, Belgium does it better, why can't we? No, what is Belgium actually doing? What steps did they take? What was some of the resistance that they ran into? It avoids hype and advocacy. Usually there are many responses to a problem. We are not saying, follow this, follow that. We are saying, look at these responses that are happening. Any questions before I move on? Hi. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. We consider it good journalism as well. My job is to work with news agencies, and many times I go into a newsroom, or my team, we go into a newsroom, and that's the response we get. It's just good journalism. And then sometimes we ask them to ask themselves, but why aren't you doing it? Right? So in order to address an issue or a gap, you have to define it. Then you're not addressing it at all. So that's why. Any questions? Any more questions? All right, so why do solution journalism? We believe that covering solutions can strengthen accountability, it can increase reader engagement, and it simply just gives the whole story. As you said, it's just good journalism. Journalism's role. Journalists act as whistleblowers, exposing wrongdoing. Putting out social problems will spur reform. That's the theory. We're going to tell the audience, tell our readers, tell our viewers that there's a problem. It's a problem, it's a problem, it's a problem, it's a problem, it's a problem. You know, this is the idea of watchdog, being a watchdog, and we should do that, and we should never stop doing that. But we ask that we move from watchdog to guide dog as well. Not just, it's not enough for journalists just to uncover what the issues are, but we should also be a hope for change. People seek credible responses to the problems in their lives. not just complaining about it all the time. And I like this part about people seek credible responses, because we all live every day in our towns, in our cities, or as global citizens. And we all end up in just regular conversations about what the problem is. But sometimes it's just interesting to switch that conversation and ask the people who are in front of you, okay, what could be, who does not have this problem? Where doesn't have this problem? What did they do? And that changes the entire dynamic of your conversation moving forward. A prime example of this is the Cleveland Plain Dealer. They did a piece about lead poisoning in Cleveland. And if you know anything about any type of health issue in the US, it always has a component of race and racism in it. And they've been doing this story for years, right? Everyone knows this is a problem at this point. Non-contamination goes unabated. Poor code enforcement leaves children at risk in dangerous homes. So they do this investigation. What is the problem? This is important to tell. We think it should be told. But then they decided to take the solutions lens, because everyone knew what the problem was. They knew how it got to that point. What now? So they did this piece about toxic neglect. And this is just a breakdown of the piece. But it talks about what successful cities were doing and what Cleveland was doing. Before children were poisoned, successful city inspected homes before children were poisoned. Cleveland waited until after the fact. The horse had already left the barn. Widespread before symptoms emerged, after symptoms emerged. And this was basically the crux of their story, looking at what successful cities did that had this issue at some point and no longer experienced this problem. And they published this piece and said, now what? What is your excuse now? They actually used Rochester, which is a city not too far from Cleveland, relatively speaking, with similar demographics. Rochester had that same problem. They don't have the problem anymore. And they investigated what Rochester did to get from point A to point B, and they published it. And the impact was telling. Cleveland's health department director and three or four deputy commissioners were fired. The city's lead inspection staff rose from 3 to 4, and so on and so on. This was showing a path of how to solve the issue. It was not saying you need to take this path or this path or this path or this path. It simply said, this is what successful cities did. They took different types of policy changes. You have options instead of excuses. This is a quote from one of the reporters. The interesting thing about this story was, after doing all her research, after the team did all their research and figured out which cities they wanted to talk about, what policies were in place, they spoke to experts, they spoke to people on the ground, but they actually also spoke to local reporters. I only found out a few months ago that the journalist at Cleveland Dealer called up her counterpart in Rochester Democrat and said, hey, we came across all these policies, we did all this research. Is this the real deal, or is this just people saying, hey, this is a good thing, come look at us? And the reporter helped vet that story, because that reporter was a housing reporter for Rochester. So that reporter had context. That reporter also became an expert in looking at what that story was. We are all experts here in something. It wouldn't hurt to ask a question about, hey, we have an issue with, again, say malaria in South Asia, in Sri Lanka maybe. What is Tanzania doing? Do you have that same issue? It is the same geography, same warm weather, same mosquitoes, or same type of mosquitoes. It can increase reader engagement. News fatigue brought many of the participants to a learned helpless response. The negativity of the news added to desire to tune out. I personally see this in my everyday life. People just gonna get bombarded by bad news. The governments, local governments, home, traffic, policies, politics, immigration, and so on and so forth. That's us telling the world there are problems, and it's going to be here, without giving a path about how other places or places within your community are responding to the problem. Evidence suggests that when people think something can be done about a problem, they are more receptive and attentive to the information. Oh, and FYI, as a journalist, I love actually getting primary sources. So if anyone wants links to any of these things, please let me know. I could send it to you, and you could read through the report yourself. So it's not just me saying, oh, wow, look at these numbers. No, you could go through it yourself. Negative messages spread faster than positive ones, but positive ones reach a larger audience. A study by the BBC found that 64% of those under 35 want news to provide solutions to problems, not just tell them about certain issues. Engagement rose on A/B testing from 10 to 20, between 10 to 25%. The BBC actually now has 4 shows focused on solutions journalism, or with a solutions journalism core added. And the idea is still the same. How are people responding to the issues around them? One of them is called My Perfect Country, which I find very entertaining because their philosophy is, if we were to build a perfect country, what ideas do we steal from around the world? What ideas do we steal as it pertains to policy, as it pertains to large or small organizations? It could be a school that's doing something that can be scaled. It could be a government that's actually successfully integrating immigrants coming in or refugees coming in. Another prime example of this is the poverty puzzle. This was done by Chattanooga Times Free Press. It was nominated, it was a runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize in 2017. It came second to the Panama Papers. That's not bad considering that it was 4 journalists in Tennessee. Panama Papers, 200 people. Not bad at all. And they decided to do a solutions-focused series on poverty in their city. And the idea was simple. We all report about poverty, the big capital letters, poverty. But how are people responding to this? Who's having success? Who's failing? Why? And they decided to do a multi-series part that took slices of the issue. Not the full, all poverty, but they looked at it through religion, they looked at it through education, and so on. It was beautiful. I had lots of photos, lots of in-depth reporting, and this was done by local journalists. This wasn't the New York Times coming in. These were people who understood the actual on-the-ground dynamics of what policy change meant. And this is some of the impact. Several city council members were voted out and replaced by African Americans who have come out of poverty. Mayors and a well-addressed business leaders focus on econ mobility, new platform echoes, and the poverty puzzle. One of the reporters said she knew that the impact of the story was real when she went to church the next week and the preacher was talking about it. Impact is not always about views or engagement, but it's about what it means to the actual people you're reporting, not just on, but for. And lastly, it gives the whole story. It's just good journalism, as you said. And usually I play around with this section. I usually have some stories I put in here for regular presentations, but I wanted to touch on just 3 very different stories. One is done by AJ Plus, and this talks about, well, as it says, how one of the most dangerous cities in America reduced gun violence. Most of the stories you hear coming out about gun violence, most of the stories are the same. It's bad. It's terrible. There's nothing we could do. It's bad. It's terrible. There's nothing we could do. Or there's something we could do, but we hit resistance. But this is a city that's actually having success. We know it's having success because of data. We know it's having success because the reporters spoke to people on the ground. And they spoke about the limitations, the caveats, where the successes are and where the failures are. Again, change that dynamic. Instead of 90% problems, somebody could solve it somewhere. 90% how people are responding to that problem as well. Fixes, which is a column done by two of our co-founders, David Bornstein and Tina Rosenberg. They do this column every week on New York Times. Every week for the last few years, they have found a story focused on a response to a problem. The responses are out there on a weekly basis. This story specifically focuses on what this water park is doing to be more inclusive. Inclusion in this case means children with disabilities. Talk about telling the full story. This is a story that's not told. How did the person start the water park? What had to be done? What are the limitations? What are the successes? Lastly, Vox, which I personally love. I like their explainers. Talks about traffic. Every city has some argument about traffic and complaint. But Vox did this piece about how Barcelona is taking city streets back from cars, and it talks about what is being done to respond to the traffic issues, where it's being done, can it be applied in other places, what are the limitations to applying it to other places, and what are the limitations some places apply when they try it. So one of the examples they brought up was that when you have a super block, it really locks down streets from traffic, so it allows people to have street fairs and walk through and kids to play in the street and so forth. And they spoke about in a place like New York, they do that, but only in rich areas, not in poor areas. That is a caveat. That is important to tell. If you don't mention things like that, you're not telling the full story. Any questions before moving on? Yeah, sure. And feel free to, again, make these notes about the stories you have in mind. I'm trying to cut across a lot of different topics, a lot of different examples. They're not limited to one thing.
See, all these, like solution journalism, to all of us who are in this profession for so long years, for so many years, it comes across as, to me, it comes across as something like just a new terminology for what the establishment always wants us to do, positive stories. Like, we go to cover any natural calamity. So, like you highlight the people's problem, the establishment will immediately come and they will say, oh, no, you did your bit. Now, please do something about our relief camps also. So, and you talked about that, BBC got some viewership or, they got more readership. But that is always, in any newsroom, the ad department, the advertisement department is always pushing for their own, they want to cultivate favors with the powers that be. Yeah. So that is why they will keep on pushing, please do this, you guys been doing all this negative journalism, highlighting too many problems. So now please do some positive stories also. So I want to ask you how this solution journalism is different from so-called positive journalism, which, people or a journalist is always been asked by, the authorities or the powers that be, that please do it.
No problem. I actually touch on this in this section, so I'm glad you brought it up. But the short answer to that is, at the end of the day, you are an investigative journalist. This is not about PR. This is not about saying everything is good in the world, everything is bad in the world. It's talking about these responses and the caveats. The person who wants you to do this positive story, chances are they just want you to say, all is good, we're a perfect organization. We are not saying that. We are saying, tell the whole story. If things are working, explain why it's working. If things aren't working, say it's not working. In doing a research about the health department, per se, if one aspect of their policy seems to have, by the data and the anecdotes, seems to be working, why not say that? Why not talk about what other people can learn from this process? This is not about, again, advertisement or PR or even advocacy. It's about doing hardcore reporting and following the qualitative and quantitative data about how people are responding to this issue. If someone feels good about it, that's fine. But as we said, it's not always positive, but it's useful. Thank you for the
Hi.
question.
I was curious to hear more of how did you follow the impact of the stories? Are the reporters on the stories following it? Because you said like, oh, someone entered the church that day, but if they didn't, how do you follow like the impact? And sometimes it's also difficult to do the correlation out. Were those people like let go because of the news or not? How do you follow this impact?
That's a good question. And that's something that we haven't perfected yet. And to be quite frank, no news agency really has, right? Beyond what we see metrics coming in, it's very difficult to tell. In that case, for Chattanooga, it was easier because it's a relatively small city, well, small by global standards. The news reporters are tapped into the community, and they got hundreds of comments and letters coming in saying, this happened because of this, quite frankly, responses. So in that case, it was easy for them. It came to them. But that's something each newsroom has to figure out for their audience. How does their audience consume and share news, right? It gets more complicated if you're working with a diaspora that gets its news from WhatsApp. You know, how do you start measuring that impact unless someone says, I am doing this because of this piece of journalism here? So the short answer is we don't have a concrete answer for that. We can help you brainstorm it by any means, whatever story you're doing. But there's no, within engagement, there's no silver bullet. Again, right? What are the caveats?
Yeah, solution journalism sounds so good, but the problem I have is pitching. You know, the editors don't really understand it. I've tried to pitch several times, but they will want to ask me, why do you want to travel and spend this kind of resources on a story like this when we have so many challenges, so many things that you can report on? Yeah. So what interest do you have in this story? So they think that you have a personal interest in this story, right? And it's not a piece of journalism, so they don't fund it. Right.
So, where are you from, if I may ask?
Nigeria.
So it's funny, we actually just worked with an organization in Nigeria, Nigeria Health Watch, and they had these same questions. So what we do, as I mentioned up top, we work with editors, we work with journalists, we work with policymakers sometimes, and the change has to happen on top, right? You could have this idea as a journalist, but the editor has to say, yes, I think this is worth it. And that's a question we get a lot. What we've done on our website, which I'm going to touch on at the end of this presentation, we have a list of editors and news organizations that actually take solutions-focused pitching. Nigeria Health Watch is actually one of them. Science Africa in Kenya is another one. And it goes on and on and on about who to contact and what those pitches are. I recommend that you join the hub. That's when you see that list and you see who will accept the solutions pitch. So yeah, it's tough. Some editors don't see it. That's why we try to have a newsroom buy-in overall, an institutional buy-in. But it's difficult. What we do as an organization is really try to connect the journalists who want to do this with the editors who want to do it as well. It's not a perfect system, but with the idea of solutions, if you have suggestions, we're definitely up for taking it on. Yes.
So it's really difficult to do solutions journalism in a polarized society. So that's okay, authorities might like it or not like it, it doesn't matter, but the readers, so half of the country wants to hear just, problems, they don't want to see the solutions. So the other half doesn't want to see any problems, they just think it's just all pink world. So then being a journalist, being a true journalist is really difficult because then you get the reaction from the readers and it's an unfair reaction. So what do you do then?
In my experience, no matter what I write or record or take a photograph of, it's going to be an unfair reaction once it's polarizing. And And that happens when you do a deep investigation of what the problem is anyway, right? I think about where I'm from in the Caribbean. If I were to do a deep investigation about how the government is dealing with drugs coming in, that problem, people are going to say, you're anti-government, we don't like you. I could report about what the government actually is doing well to integrate a group of people religiously, and people are going to say, you're pro-government. It's tough, but we should always strive to tell the whole story either way. We come across really interesting issues when it comes to gun violence, as I mentioned on top, and telling the stories about how people are responding to it, what works, what doesn't work. And the journalists who have written about this, we've worked with the Trace, for example. I think I have an example from the Trace later down. They stand by their reporting at the end of the day. They stand by the research they've done, by the people they've spoken to, and the research they continue to do moving forward. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's tough. One of the good things, though, about solutions journalism is that depending on the topic, you can actually bring people together. So we worked with a journalist in Ohio Valley, and he did a piece on coal country. So black lung is a disease you get as a miner mining in coal country. And it's on the rise again. It's been on the rise for about 3 years, if I'm correct. 3 or 5 years. So it existed about 8 years ago, was wiped out, now it's back. It's back because of poor practices by these mining companies trying to cut corners, save money. The people who are working are the people who it hurts most. And he is a liberal guy, or I shouldn't say liberal, but he works for what people consider liberal public media. And he did this story about how black lung was eradicated more or less, and how it can be eradicated now, and by examples from different places in the world. Again, systematic journalism, systematic reporting, evidence-based reporting. It's not about opinion, this is about what happens. And he said, when I was speaking to him last year, that a shock jock, again, quote unquote, conservative shock jock, brought him on to talk about this. This guy from Liberal Public Media, because his philosophy, the reporter's philosophy was, our sons and uncles and fathers and grandfathers are dying from this, and they don't have to. That's not a partisan argument. So I say that to say, sometimes it actually helps bridge that gap, depending on what your audience engagement is like if it's built into it. Sometimes it's not. But it shouldn't stop you from telling the whole story by any means. Okay, yeah, no, I have another section, but I could take questions.
Is this the last one?
Yeah, and then we're gonna, yeah, this is the last section, and then we're gonna go into this.
Okay, thanks for what you've done so far. I've seen how I've fallen into the trap of not being a solutions journalist.
I have as well.
In South Africa, it's really interesting. The investigative journalist, we've got an amazing investigative journalism, I would say, community, and Bruce has met some of them. And they certainly do not practice solutions journalism, but they were very key in bringing down the incredibly corrupt government that has just kind of changed. The president resigned. But at the same time, I think that all of us who have read their investigations feel incredibly battered. And so it's so difficult because whilst they did play a part in bringing down the government, I still think that public morale has suffered incredibly badly because of how they wrote, in fact. And I don't want to, I think it's not the only thing that we are, why we're suffering, but I do think it definitely played a part. So I'm just wondering how the balance is, achieved. And I know that you've spoken about it, but it might be interesting to hear your perspective in a country like South Africa.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Thank you all for the questions. At least in my experience working with newsrooms, that balance is really dependent on you and the context that I don't know. If I come in and say, this is how you put this into a larger context, that's no better than an NGO coming in and say, this is how you fix your country without any local knowledge. So that's what I would like to add to that. That being said, we've had news organizations that have had full sections that was solutions based. Seattle Times has a education, it's called Ed Lab. It's a solutions based section about education. That's all they do. You have BBC, as I mentioned before, that has 4 shows among their hundreds of shows. But you also have other news agencies that have one journalist that do it in their newsroom, or they have a beat, or they have their journalists just report integrated into their beat, per se. So you could report on childhood trauma or health or education or traffic or public policy and just rope it into your beat overall. And when it comes up, don't ignore it, because that's what happens sometimes, right? We look at one aspect and we ignore it because we look at we focus on the problem. We say don't ignore it. This is not this is a tool. This is just one tool in your toolkit. You know, while you do that type of journalism, also do this as well. Also look for these stories as well. I have no idea if that answered your question.
Carry on and then.
All right, thank you for all the questions. All right, the last section. How do I do solutions journalism? Where do I find solution stories? How do I vet them? How do I move beyond? This is a really nice program. Story forms. What do solutions journalism stories look like? Period. So, identify the issue or question of concern as precisely as possible. As I mentioned, this is not about solving all of poverty or all of childhood trauma. But there are aspects of it that people are responding to, and they're having various levels of successes. You know, sometimes you have to ask yourself, instead of who has the worst, ask yourself who has the best, who has the lowest, insert whatever you're reporting overall, the most dramatic reduction, the smallest racial disparity, lowest relapse rates, highest proportion of persons progressing. That change is important. If a community was 25 out of 30 last year and now they're 5, they've clearly progressed and they're clearly doing something different than every other community or every other hospital or every other church or so on. Here's an example of that applied to incarceration. We're not trying to solve all of incarceration, but we're asking, which region has the lowest incarceration rate overall? Lowest cost per prisoner, least use of solitary confinement, highest proportion of inmates pursuing higher education. All of these are aspects of incarceration that different organizations or different places are responding to differently with different levels of success. We just finished a collaborative in Philadelphia with about 14 news organizations that spoke about recidivism, people leaving prison and coming back in Philadelphia. And these 14 news organizations did 200 stories about, maybe I could get back to you on that, about different aspects, solutions, focused stories, aspects of recidivism. People who left prison and couldn't find a job. So the idea is, I can't find a job, I'm going to go back to crime. No, there are places within Philadelphia that are stopping people committing a crime again. That is a hell of a story. That's something that shouldn't be ignored, especially if you look at the data, you interview people, rigorous reporting on that topic. Which states or which counties do not use solitary confinement? Why? What are their requirements? What are they doing differently? What can they teach other places? Ask what's missing from the public discourse. Is there a lack of awareness about the problem? Yes, well, maybe it's more suited for traditional investigative journalism. No, if there's not lack of awareness, everyone knows it's a problem. Consider solutions journalism, because you have to, as I mentioned before, define the problem before you even talk about the responses to the problem. Then you end up in really interesting situations where people don't agree what the problem is. And then that becomes a little more difficult. But yeah, define the problem first. And a good solution story, even if it is 90% about the response to the problem, you have to define the problem. You have to at least say, this is what the issue is. This is the crux of this issue. This is how the response to that specific issue makes a difference, or attempted to make a difference, because there are lessons to be learned from failed responses as well. Start hunting for candidates for solution stories by asking this simple question. Who's doing it better? I can't tell you how many times we have experts at our fingertips and we ask them about the problem, why it's so bad, it's bad, it's terrible. Well, no, it's still terrible. They are the experts. Simply asking them, oh, who does not have this problem? They will probably be able to tell you. They will be able to say, oh, wow, yeah, this problem is in Guatemala, but Belize doesn't have this problem at all, and it's the same geography. Oh, what is Belize doing that Guatemala isn't doing? Well, Belize has this policy here. It's from the ground up. Indigenous people are involved, and so on and so forth. And you get an entire story that's untouched just by asking who is doing it better. You can find these candidates everywhere. Those same think tanks I mentioned earlier. Ask them who's doing it better. Academic experts. I'm a data guy. Large databases. A lot of times we see a database and we look for the dark red spot. You know, the spot that says this is bad, let's go there. As opposed to, oh wow, look at this other spot that's not as dark red, it's light blue. What are they doing differently? And they have the same demographics. Experts also, you can find experts in these conferences as well. You have a question?
I've just been thinking about it because in as much as I want to practice that, and it's a good approach. Sometimes making governments accountable for some of these problems, I can't afford to like speak 90% about the solution, especially when I need them to do something about it.
Right.
Yeah. Like for instance, we have some areas that don't have vaccines for kids, and you know when a baby turns at a certain age, they need the vaccines.
Right.
And then I'm trying to say how women have to travel to walk for like 10 hours to go get this vaccine elsewhere. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me because I just want to talk about the issue and get the government to do something about it, whether to take the suppliers there. I mean, how do I go about that while appreciating that these women sometimes have to work?
Yeah.
I need to get the government to do something about this.
Yeah.
So I'm in a dilemma there. I've been thinking about it and I don't know, how do I apply this? Or are there areas where you can't just do solutions journalism and just do your thing and then later on maybe you can explore solutions journalism? I don't know.
Thank you. Yeah, good question. It's tough, and that's what we get those same questions everywhere we go, right? And what we say is, in thinking about it this way, it's telling the whole story, and it's difficult because you want the government to change. But sometimes, there was one newsroom actually used the fact that they were rivals with another state to shame their state. That was their accountability. They basically said, hey, state B got their act together. What is your excuse? Right? And that was shaming the politicians right in front of their face. It's using their own ego against them. But different places, it works differently. Like if I were talking to you in a newsroom setting, not to get into too much detail now, I would brainstorm with you this question, right? What is the dynamic there? What can you do? What can't you do? What are the limitations? And what are the opportunities that people aren't taking advantage of? So we could talk after to get more details. But it can be done with the collaboration we're doing in East Africa as well, Nigeria, because Nigeria is collaborating with East African countries. Very much that question has come up. And the way one of the editors is dealing with it is very much that Nigeria, you're the beacon of one of the beacons on the continent. What is your excuse when you have mobile payments in Nairobi and Kenya, right? Or Uganda has better healthcare with lower response times. That's the kind of way they're thinking about it. Also, what they can learn from it, right? Because I bet you that's not the only place in the world or in the region or in the county where under circumstance A, women have to walk 10 hours. but another program gets the medicine or gets the phone cards to them in front of their face, where they are, meet them where they are. You know, what can you learn from that process as well? But anyway, we could talk into more details after. Just wanted to give a broader answer. Anyway, so where can we find candidates? You can find candidates at conferences like these. The journalist who just asked that question, you are an expert in your region. You know where you have issues, and you know what issues don't apply to you because you actually are working at it well. So well that it may not even dawn on you. The keynote speaker, Dr. Harris, was actually interviewed for a story earlier this year, a solution story by our co-founder. She's an expert. Ask her who's doing it better. What policy is actually working in this case? How can it be scaled? What are some of the resistance? What is the resistance to it, if there's any resistance? What are the limitations? We also have a solutions journalism story tracker where on our website, we aggregate all the best solution journalism stories from around the world. If you ever do a piece, you're free to submit your story. It's free to use, it's free to sign up, it's free to submit. We are open source. This is not about monetization. This is about sharing knowledge. So you can check there to start off with. Just search whatever topic or region you're thinking about and check out some of the stories fellow journalists have done. Trauma, 292 stories. You could do early childhood trauma, I think has 52 stories. We gather it from around the world. Hopefully by next year we could start pulling different languages as well. As I mentioned, our toolkit is in about 5 or 7 languages. I'm not too sure where it is right now. And hopefully the stories we'll be pulling will start in those languages. English, French, Mandarin, Bahasa, Indonesian, Russian, Arabic. These stories come with different issue areas, success factors. So it goes back to your question. How successful were they? Were they just successful in a community, or was this applied on a national scale or regional scale? Who was the journalist, outlets, large and small, some radio, some community, some broadcasts, some public, some commercial. We have newsrooms like the BBC, but we also have newsrooms like the Richland Source, about 7 journalists, or 7 staff members, 4 journalists. Different lengths. A solution journalism story doesn't need to be a documentary or 3,000 words. You can actually hit all those points pretty quickly, actually, especially when people already understand what the issue is. By date, and if you sign up to be a hub member, you can sort through that as well. This is the Solutions Journalism Story Tracker. When choosing your story, remember, it doesn't have to be the solution. It doesn't have to solve all of poverty or all of mental health. You can address a problem in whole or in part. Get evidence to support claims of success. This is not advocacy. This is not this is not hero worship. This is not us saying we like this thing. Let's report on it. Let's see evidence. Let's see data. Let's see anecdotes. Tell the audience about the limitations, if there are any. And focus on the how. This is not just about saying this county does it better, Finland does it better, this other place does it better. How? What exactly is being done? Key questions to ask when you're doing these kind of stories. As I mentioned before, who's doing it better? Very straightforward question, can lead you down a very interesting rabbit hole. Where did the idea come from? What does the research say? What do critics say? Again, this is not a puff piece. This is not advocacy. How does the response work? What parts of the problem aren't addressed in the response? You could have a response to an issue about food security, but it doesn't solve necessarily the transportation problem, the distance problem. Mention that, you know. What are the barriers to replication? There's an example I wanted to pull up here, but I didn't get a chance to put it in, about the barriers to replication. The Trace, which is a news agency that focuses on gun violence, have been doing stories about gun violence for years. You know, in the United States, same issue, same day, different day, same problem. And they did a solution story about the state that has high gun ownership and low mass shootings, which is a different way of thinking about it, as opposed to other places that say the world doesn't have this problem, Finland doesn't have this problem, Australia doesn't have this problem, Japan doesn't have this problem, which they don't. But it's saying in the United States, there's a state that has successfully married both. Wherever you stand on the gun issues, that is a data point that you want to look at and ask why. And one of the reasons why, among different policies and how they execute it, is the fact that they're an island miles away off the coast. You can't drive a gun from state A to state B. You have to fly there. That kind of limits it. That's a barrier that really can't be replicated. But it's still an important story to tell, right? Why is here so different than other places? Still in the United States, still under federal law. So you start seeing where you have those comparisons and what you can learn from there. The different types of storytelling techniques. Solutions journalism stories have characters. They don't have to read like a report. They can be interesting. They are full of life. They are full of people, whether it's a person making the change or a policy making the change or the people affected by the change. Overcoming obstacles. We spend millions or billions of dollars as human beings reading stories about people overcoming obstacles. We know they're going to survive. We know they want James Bond for the next movie. We watch it still the same because we want to know how. How did they succeed? What did they do? How did they get out of this issue or this problem? You can have a rich solutions story. Don't forget that, with characters. But remember, focus on what the characters are doing, how they're trying to solve the problem, what are the results they're getting. Chances are it didn't succeed the first time. The story I showed earlier about the city with gun violence, it was Richmond, California, if I'm correct. That was a project that was tweaked every year. So the first year they had success and failures, they tweaked it, they had more success, they tweaked it, they had more success. And every time that story is being told by a news agency, they talk about that change. They came in with this idea, it didn't work, or it didn't work fully, they had to change it. That's interesting, that's compelling storytelling. Show what we can learn from it. Think about it this way, how done it? How did they escape that trap? How did they make things different? How did they get from 25th place to 2nd place in 2 years? Why does County A not have this issue in schools, but the county right next door does? Positive deviance. Don't just look at what's happening, what the worst statistics are. Look at what also is happening on the other end of the spectrum and how did they get there, especially over time. This is the Trace story I mentioned earlier. Comparison, compare two places next to each other or with similar demographics or similar geography or the same place over time. Quickie. Doesn't need to be, as I mentioned, 3,000 words. This story right here was 575 words. If you lived in New York, we don't need to go into great detail about bed bugs. Bed bugs are bad. They're a problem. Now let's go on to the solution story. Bold new idea. This is one of the earliest stories about Richmond, California. Did this city bring down its murder rate by paying people not to kill? And they tweaked it, and they tweaked it. It's a compelling headline, actually. I know. And it's funny, because when you see headlines like that, people just comment just based on the headline without reading the story. We should not pay criminals. Well, like, read the story. You clearly didn't read it. You read the headline, got mad, and typed. But that's a hell of a compelling story. Investigative series. As I mentioned before, you read investigative series that lasts 2, 3, 4, 5 parts, and it's all about the problem and different aspects of the problem. If the problem is understood, do an investigative series about 4 or 5 parts that shows about people responding to it, different aspects of it, like Chattanooga did. They didn't just say poverty was bad and it historically has been bad and these people are corrupt. They were like, wow, look at people responding. There is this neighborhood with high graduation rates, a low income neighborhood with high graduation rates. What are they doing differently? Can it be scaled? So in conclusion, solutions journalism is rigorous reporting on responses to social problems. It is important to give the whole story. You do solutions journalism by asking who is doing it better. We have more resources online, as I mentioned earlier. We have the basic toolkit and 3 others, health, education, and we're expanding every few months. They're all free. You could go online and sign up and access it. They're in Chinese, Spanish, French, Bahasa, Arabic, Russian, and so on. You want to learn more? Sign up for the hub. It's free, again. And there you can get online training. You don't have to do all in bulk. You can always go back and forth, or if you have a question, go back to the training. See what other journalists are doing in your region or in your subject area, or subject areas or regions. And you could submit your stories. And your stories are not just read by your primary community who you're reading and writing for, but they're also read by people all over the world who are reporting on that same topic. It's funny because working primarily in the US, a lot of times we get the response, what can we learn from the developing world? And then I say, oh really, that issue you have in your town in Alabama, they don't have in Nigeria or Uganda or Botswana. And they're like, really? Like, yeah, because they've found a way to respond to it. How can you learn from this? It really gives people, journalists, and the people we report for, not just on, a level of agency in their knowledge and their reactions to the issues. So that's all I have for today. Thank you very much.
We do have a few more, couple minutes for questions, 10 minutes or so. So go, somebody who has the mic.
Hi, thanks so much for that. I write for apolitical on policy stuff, and we do quite a lot with Solutions Journalism Network. And what I've been really interested to find out, doing solutions journalism between different countries and their policies around the world, is some places or some groups of people are extremely keen to learn from other places comparison-wise, and others are, like in the States, for example, don't see how on earth somewhere on the other side of the world could apply to them. Yeah. What have you learned in terms of those comparisons about, on one hand, whether there's more people are the same and are convinced easily, and on the other hand, how can you start to turn people's minds and open people's minds to think about where else these solutions could be learned from?
And there are 3 aspects of that. One is measuring impact, which I mentioned earlier, imperfect science. Is measuring impact, which is imperfect, right? So you can't always follow the impact of a story or project. At least us, because we have to go through the newsroom and the newsroom has to go through its own idea of impact. The second thing I want to mention is challenge that idea. A lot of times we go into newsrooms and people have this idea, our readers or viewers don't like this. When last did you challenge that notion? Never. So don't be afraid to challenge it. Again, you may realize it is the issue, and that's fine. And the third thing is that human beings, like according to behavioral economics, human beings don't change by facts, we change by storytelling. And we are storytellers. You can tell a compelling story about why you are more similar, at least in this slice, to someone across the world or someone across a border or someone across a county, have more in common with them on this issue than something else. That has to be part of your storytelling, especially when you're doing a comparison. Because if you don't do that, people aren't going to walk with you to that point. Because in your mind, you'll be like, of course, it makes sense. These are 2 tropical places. Yes. But no, you have to say, well, look at this. This is where we are. this is where they were because of whatever your storytelling technique is like that. And again, it also goes back to, are you doing it by radio? NPR, WNYC did an amazing job about incarceration of minors, and they went to Germany. And part of that storytelling was, why did we have to go to Germany, and what are we comparing here, right? Because Germany is a very different country. So what are we comparing here? It's like, oh, these are the things they had similar. I'm taking you along this journey about why we are here. And while telling the story, the solution story, there are touchstones that say, oh, wow, yeah, this kid is just like my kid, or this kid is similar to someone I know. But storytelling, that bottom answer is, that's a storytelling technique. Question.
Yeah, Ahmad.
Yeah, thank you. We at Radio Free Europe, we have a 15-minute weekly feature by the name of Problems and Solutions. And we address the issues and cover the stories ranging from health, education, water and sanitation to the violence, displacement, war, and natural disasters. We identify the problems and talk to the people, their responses, but it is quite difficult for us most of the time because most of the stories, the government is accountable, or the state is responsible for those stories, for those problems, to solve them. But it's quite difficult for us to get them online or to talk to them, to the government, in order to solve the problems or respond to the problems. Do you have a magic how to make them agree, the government officials?
No.
Shame them.
Yeah, exactly. Shame. No, it's tough. We're all reporting in different climates in different regions, with different limitations and, again, different opportunities. That's a discussion I think I will brainstorm with you a lot closer, because it's not just a question of they don't like this. Like, there's a difference between they don't like this in America and they don't like this in Uganda. So it's just asking about how much room do you have to play with in that question, and also whose angle are you telling this story from, right? You could tell a solutions journalism story from the bottom up, the person's life who's changed on the ground as well. What are they doing to respond to the problem the government has made? That's a very important story to tell in a systematic way. The reason I liked the poverty puzzle was because one of the things in the US journalists don't touch on a lot on is religion. And they went straight to it. They said, we're going to go to a church and touch on two things. The fact that the church overall is doing a lot of charity, but there's no real data about the outcome. And there's this one church that decided to follow the data and change what they're doing. That's bottom up. Yes, the systematic problem is governmental and societal, but someone has decided to do things differently to respond and is getting positive evidence against it, whether the government likes it or not.
Taina?
I have a question here. Thanks, first of all, for the really interesting presentation. But I was thinking in my work, when I'm sitting in the newsroom preparing the daily news, I have always to start with the strongest one, and the strongest is always related to violence, or, and my editor will say, oh, you have to start with the strongest one. So I wanted to, first of all, ask which are the challenges, or how to apply solutions journalism in daily news? And thinking about a concrete topic, someone asked me yesterday about the topic refugees in Germany. Every time I turn on my radio or the TV, like 70%, 80% of the news are related to the refugees. And sometimes reinforcing stereotypes, because if you have something more related to solutions journalism, you go to features. You go to listen, the public know where to go, and there are different public consuming different platforms. Right. So I wanted you to comment on these topics, how to apply to the news, and in terms of platforms to features, and how to implement solution journalism in both of them.
All right, no problem. Just to clarify, are you a beat reporter?
Yeah, well, I do both things. I work in preparing daily news, and also sometimes reporting. I do both.
All right. So I've personally had very little experience with talking to people about preparing daily news on that end. we could talk later, and I could give you the contact for someone who could speak much more fluently on that from our team. But as it pertains to a beat, there are news organizations that just train their journalists to look for these on their beat, basically. Not just reporting on the problem, not just looking at the biggest worst, but saying, hey, also write about this as well. But at the end of the day, it really depends on your editor, because you could want to do this, but you have to have your editor on board. And that's why on our end, at least my team specifically in solution journalism, we train the newsroom, but we have to have that editorial buy-in, because you could want to do that and the editor will keep on pushing that it leads story every single time. We don't have a silver bullet about how to convince that editor to change their mind. Some journalists I know do the shock and awe on the positive side. Again, that whole embarrassing politicians. That state next door solve this problem. What the hell is your problem? It's like, oh wow, yeah, we should write that. We don't like the mayor. That sometimes works. It really, again, tackles someone's ego. But there's no silver bullet. You know what your editor wants, and sometimes you just have to work it in there to suit.
Hi. So my question is, what makes a response this kind of journalism worthy? Because in my country, I come from India, and the sentiment is very anti-minority, and there have been episodes of lynching and cold-blooded lynching by mobs and all of that's been happening, and at least one episode every month, like if I'm and it's recent, it's like last 2-3 years, okay, since the government changed. So a couple of communities, like at least one community I saw, they got together, the majority religion people and Muslims got together, and there was interaction. Now, is that kind of a response the story worthy, but we can't gauge how much that interaction had an impact. Like, we can't gauge the impact of that response. But is it still worthy of this kind of story? Or should we just wait and observe the kind of impact it's going to have over the months or a year?
And what do you mean by you can't? What do you mean you can't measure the impact?
I mean, like you said, there's reduced violence or something like that, or a reduced number of harassment, and Muslims living they feel safe in that area.
Yeah.
So, like, say they held a meet today, I can't say that in next few months. So, like that kind of impact I'm talking about.
Right, and thank you. That's a very good point. And you were talking about that, and I was thinking about where I'm from too. That's a limitation, right?
If I could add to the same question about the solution. So I come from a country where you give them solutions, but the government is not going to take it because they've been reducing funding on public expenditure. So you offer them a solution. It looks really nice. The story is damn nice. People also feel good about it. Oh, there is a solution, but do they really incorporate it? That's another.
Right. Thank you. So the two questions, I'll answer it in reverse. So the first would be this in reverse. The government doesn't incorporate it if you do a solution story. Chances that it won't incorporate it if you do a problem-oriented story. So that's a problem either way, whether you choose to do a solution-oriented story or not. And that goes back into a whole question about relationship between government and media and people. But also, it doesn't necessarily have to be the government making a change. It may make a change in the community from the bottom up, right? So in the place of Chattanooga, other churches saw what this church was doing, and they were like, oh, we should do something similar, right? So you don't always have to put it on the government, even though it's the government's job. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of how countries are made up. And you're right, to go back to your first question, you don't know what's going to happen in a year right now. And that's a limitation. That's a caveat, right? You could go there, speak to the Muslim citizens and say, do you feel safer than a year ago? Are you more likely to go jogging at night, as you mentioned? That's an impact. That's saying, yes, we feel safer. And ask them, do you think this is going to be here for a year? Your evidence is that they feel safer. The community feels more engaged in the overall society. That's the evidence. That's the data point, for lack of a better word. But the caveat is we don't know if it's going to stay. And that's fine. Again, this is about telling the whole story, because what ends up happening is the Muslim minority in this town is oppressed 2 years ago. Things are better, we're not going to talk about it. Everyone else who reads the news is going to say, oh yeah, they're still oppressed. They still feel crappy. No, tell the full story. Tell the whole story. And they may say, you know what, we feel much safer, but except in this part of town now. Again, not a perfect solution, but it's definitely a much better than it was a year ago or 2 years ago. So yeah, tell that full story. It shouldn't stop you.
Do one more, and then I want to say something, and we'll take a break.
So you wait and observe what happens after these meetups are held, and then write about it.
I would say follow the evidence. And some evidence takes time, some evidence is immediate. But when you follow the evidence, you find the caveats as well. So in this case, you know that situation a lot better than I do. You may say, let me wait and see. Somebody else who may know the situation may say, you know what? I am embedded in this community and this is different. I should write about this now. And that might be a good track for other people as well. And for people to recognize what's happening in their overall community. Because then the other thing too is that people are segmented in their own community. So,
right. Who is Lynn? Did you?
Well, it's like ambiguous because it's maybe too depressing a question.
Use the mic.
But I won't repeat that. This is all brilliant, and thank you, and I've learnt a lot. The problem I have with it is there's an assumption of a sort of liberal democratic consensus that if we just are reasonable and give people good ideas and everybody will change for the better. And what frightens me about today, which is different from when I grew up, and I think maybe it's because many people that I know haven't experienced, or many people in the West I'm talking about, is that there is now a whole value system outside our liberal democratic consensus, which celebrates the denial of other people's rights, which believes that death is a good thing, that thinks that actually a small number of people are entitled when large numbers of people are not, and that has no interest in the kind of solutions that the liberal democratic consensus offers. And it would be quite happy for climate change to remove large sections of the population because that would leave more for them. For example, so one solution to climate change is that good, because we need a small population. And I wonder, I'm looking to you to how we tackle that, because it's not appealing to the liberal reason, it's how we change a mindset. For example, just to give you a small example, in the ECD realm, one of the most popular online games now, appealing to 8 and 9-year-olds in Britain today, is a game called Fortnite, in which the winner has eliminated everybody else. Okay, and 9-year-olds are playing it to a point of addiction, okay? And there are Minecraft games like that as well. So I'm very frightened, and I'd like you to cheer me up.
Yeah, no pressure at all. Thank you. So this is a combination of a lot of the answers I've been giving today, which is the people who are looking for solutions will care about this. It's as journalists, it's our job to make it available. The people who think it's okay right now, whether you do an investigative piece or not, a negative investigative piece or not, it's really not going to make a difference. You're writing for them, and they don't want to read you anyway, right? So that's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is the fact that there are lots of different ways to tackle an issue, and it's people may stand by their liberal democracy side or their conservative side or their populist side or religious extremist side. And that's how people choose to identify, and that is fine or not fine. It's their actions that really cause a problem after the fact. Solutions journalism's goal is to simply tell a solution story that's rigorously reported. People actually like to see people responding. It actually gives people a lot more agency than you realize. So it is not just about these kids getting addicted to a problematic game, but it's also the fact that that game has also brought people together who may have been siloed because they were not talking to each other because of different reasons. Again, you have to tell the full story. So that's an important story to tell, and that should be told. But talk about the response to the issue. Talk about people responding to addiction. Talk about people responding to loneliness, which is actually a problem brought up by the medical, I forgot what his title is, head doctor of the U.S. That's important. And if that's not being told, you're going to throw the baby out of the bathwater because you're going to say this is all terrible without learning from places that has really made a difference and responding in a positive way. I have no idea if that cheered you up, but I hope it was useful.
Okay, thank you. I just want to add a couple things. This has been a very provocative conversation for me. In general, on the Dart Center's broad terrain of violence and tragedy and aftermath, and in particular on our theme of trauma and resilience in early childhood. A couple of quick thoughts from where I sit. First of all, one of the, for me, powerful things about this solutions journalism lens, only one lens, right? But is that it's not a Band-Aid. What Mikhael has told us over and over again is that violence is still violence, war is still war, corruption is still corruption, child abuse is still child abuse, genocide is still genocide, and our job is to call these things out, right? And we do. But that if we are not, if the job of journalism rests on the kind of crazy faith, crazy democratic faith that people need information and stories and data in order to participate in a meaningful way in getting better policies if they're in countries that are halfway toward decent policies, or enforcing change eventually in countries that are under authoritarian rule. If we're not engaging with attainable goals and attainable solutions as part of our reporting, we're not doing half of the job. And that's nowhere more clear than on this question of early childhood issues. I would also say about getting solutions approaches on the daily agenda, and I think, Tina, that's a very, very important question. Reform in journalism, evolution in journalism happens because of arguments every single day in the newsroom, not because one person comes in with one kind of story that suddenly changes everything. And I think the question, if there's a riot, that's going to lead the news, right, that day. But you can be saying, well, do we have any story today in the bulletin that addresses a forward-looking issue or a solutions thing? Or if we're going to report on a riot, are we also reporting on places that police response have handled these confrontations better? And it's a matter of injecting a little bit of this idea into the ongoing conversation within newsrooms, right? And I would also say, and this goes, Lynn, to your point and to what we've been talking about, the various elephants. There are a bunch of elephants in this room, ranging from the border to Erdogan to all kinds of elephants that you all have brought with you. I would say that if journalism does not engage with solutions at some level on issues as fundamental as the safety and security and health of children, or the safety and security of families and communities, we are leaving people open to listen to demagogues. We are leaving people open to bumper sticker solutions and make X country great again solutions and to scapegoating solutions, rather than allowing them to engage, as Abraham Lincoln said, the better angels of our nature, right? That's actually not so much about a super hopeful liberal democracy argument. It's about the recognition that most people have arguments in their own heads and in their own communities about what the best way forward is. And if journalism isn't going to show what some of the possibilities are, then the possibilities that people seize will be the sometimes oversimplified, sometimes downright tyrannical and abusive and murderous solutions offered by people with too much power already. So that would be my little riff on this. Anyway, Mikhael, thank you.